A bitter winter's mourning the city of Chicago, as usual, wore the harsh attire of winter, with its streets covered in a thick blanket of snow and the bitter cold cutting through even the heaviest coats. It was early in the morning, too early for most people to be out, but not too early for trouble to begin. The wind howled through the city's narrow streets, flinging ice and snow into the faces of anyone unlucky enough to be outside. The city's downtown was quiet, save for the occasional car, its tires crunching over the snow, leaving fleeting tracks that would soon be covered again by the relentless wind. The sky above was an unyielding gray, heavy with the promise of another snowstorm on the horizon. Detective John Miller sat in his unmarked police car, parked just outside a small, unassuming cafe. His eyes were narrowed, his breath fogging up the window as he gazed into the distance. He didn't like mornings like this. There was something about the stillness of winter that made the world feel off-kilter, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the monotony. He often found himself feeling that way, but today was different. He was on edge. He had the unmistakable sense that something was coming, something big. And then the phone rang. Detective Miller, the voice on the other end, was sharp, urgent. "We've got a situation. A body has been found in a car just off Bellamy Avenue. We need you here now." Miller's stomach tightened, the weight of the words sinking in. A body. It wasn't the first time he'd heard those words, but something about this one felt different. "I'm on my way." The address wasn't far, and within minutes, Miller was driving through the narrow, snow-covered streets, his mind racing through the possibilities. He'd seen too many bodies in too many grim scenarios to let his guard down now, but his instincts were telling him this one would be different. This wasn't just another street crime or botched robbery. He could feel in the air, like the quiet before store, S. Miller approached the scene. The flashing blue and red lights of the squad cars painted the snow-covered street in a surreal, almost haunting glow. The police tape fluttered in the wind, cordoning off the area where the body had been discovered. There was a small crowd of onlookers gathered on the other side of the street, muttering amongst themselves, their faces hidden behind scarves and hoods. Miller parked his car, stepped out into the cold, and immediately felt the icy grip of the wind on his skin. The cold was never something he had grown used to, but he had learned to endure it over the years. He made his way through the scene, his eyes scanning everything, every detail, every movement. He had to. In his line of work, details were the difference between solving a case or letting a killer walk free. A uniformed officer, Officer Daniels, met him at the edge of the crime scene. Detective Miller, the officer, greeted him, his breath coming out in puffs of white vapor. "The body's in the car, just over here." Miller nodded, motioning for Daniels to lead the way. They walked through the cordoned-off area, past the team of crime scene investigators who were busy documenting the scene, taking photographs, and collecting evidence. The car in question was a silver Mercedes, its windows partially fogged up from the cold air outside. The door was open, and Miller could already see the body inside. A man, likely in his late 40s or early 50s, slumped over the steering wheel. His eyes were wide open, as if in shock, but his face was pale, his skin almost ashen. Blood had pooled around his head, staining the fabric of his jacket and soaking into the seat beneath him. A single, clean bullet wound was visible on his forehead, the exit wound too small to be seen. Gunshot to the head, Miller muttered to himself, kneeling beside the car. The scene was eerily still, as if the snow had swallowed up any trace of life, leaving only the body as evidence of something gone terribly wrong. "Do we have an ID yet?" Miller asked, glancing at Daniels. "Yeah," Daniels replied, pulling out a wallet from the victim's jacket pocket. "His name is Richard Harding. He's the owner of Harding Enterprises. Big business guy, you know. The police database has his information. It looks like he's had a clean record. No known enemies, no history of criminal activity. Miller nodded, his mind already ticking. Richard Harding. He had heard the name before. Harding Enterprises was one of the biggest retail chains in the city, known for its sprawling stores and high-end clientele. On the surface, it seemed like the kind of business that would attract only praise and admiration. But like all successful people, Harding must have had enemies. No one got to the top without making a few enemies along the way. Has anyone talked to the witnesses yet? Miller asked, standing up and surveying the scene once more. We got a few people who saw the car parked here early this morning. They didn't think much of it, but some of them mentioned seeing a black SUV parked a few cars down around the time the victim was last seen. No one got a good look at who was in the car, though. Any security cameras in the area? Miller asked. There's a convenience store about a block away, but their cameras are pretty old. The footage might not be useful, but we'll check it anyway. Miller took one last look at Harding's body. He had seen enough crime scenes to recognize when something didn't add up. The victim had been shot at close range, but there was no sign of struggle. No sign of an attempted robbery. It didn't make sense. If Harding had been a victim of some random crime, there should have been some sign of resistance, some evidence that he had fought back. But there was nothing. He turned back to Officer Daniels. Give me the name of everyone who might have had access to this car. And I want a list of anyone who was close to Harding in the days leading up to his death. This guy was no average businessman. He had to have made some enemies along the way. As the crime scene team continued their work, Miller took a few steps back, standing alone in the middle of the street. The wind bit at his face, but he hardly noticed. His mind was focused entirely on the case at hand. There were too many questions, too many things that didn't add up. Why would someone kill Richard Harding? Who would benefit from his death? And most importantly, who was behind this? And why? Before Miller could go any further with his thoughts, another officer approached him, holding a small object in his gloved hands. It was a credit card. No, a bank card fallen from under the car, almost hidden by the snow. The officer handed it to Miller. It's a card belonging to the victim, sir, the officer said, his voice tentative. Miller examined the card. It was one of Harding's business accounts, and the name on it matched the victim's. But why had it been discarded? Why was it lying in the snow, as though someone had intentionally dropped it? This is our first lead, Miller muttered under his breath, turning it over in his hand. The card was clearly important. It had to be. But why was it there, and what did it mean? Miller's mind raced. There was something about this crime, something more than just a random killing or a failed robbery. He had a feeling that Harding's death was the result of a much larger conspiracy, one that would lead him down a dark path. The real question, Miller thought as he pocketed the card, was just how deep this rabbit hole went. He turned to Officer Daniels. Get this card to forensics and see if they can find any prints or traces on it. This could be our link to whoever did this. Daniels nodded and walked off, while Miller stood frozen for a moment longer, his eyes scanning the empty streets. The snow continued to fall, its flakes soft and quiet, covering the world in a peaceful white veil. But the peace was an illusion. Beneath the surface, something darker was brewing, and Miller was going to find out what it was, no matter where the investigation led. Unveiling the past the morning after Richard Harding's death, Detective John Miller was already deep into his investigation. Despite the bitter cold of the winter morning, his thoughts were racing at full speed. As he sat at his desk in the small, cluttered office at the Chicago Police Department, the walls around him felt like they were closing in. His mind was overwhelmed by the many unanswered questions that were now circling his thoughts like vultures. Who would want Harding dead, and why? He had been a successful businessman, one of Chicago's retail moguls, with a clean reputation, on the surface at least. But as Miller knew all too well, the surface didn't always tell the full story. People with power, Influence and wealth often had hidden enemies, their smiles masking their darker dealings behind closed doors. Miller's fingers tapped nervously on the desk as he gazed at the file in front of him, the photo of Harding's lifeless body glaring back. He had been shot at close range, with no sign of struggle. There were no defensive wounds, no indication of a robbery gone wrong, and no indication that anyone had broken into the car. The only thing left behind, aside from the body, was a single small detail: the bank card that had been found near the car. The more Miller thought about it, the more he felt a gnawing sensation in his gut. Something wasn't right. That card, the one he'd pocketed the previous evening, was far too important to be discarded like that. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a link to something bigger, something dangerous. Whoever had dropped it had done so for a reason, and Miller was determined to figure out why. But first, he needed to learn more about Richard Harding. He needed to find out who the man really was, beyond the headlines and the public persona. Miller knew that the key to unraveling the mystery lay in Harding's past. His relationships, his business dealings, and the people in his life. Someone had to know something that could shed light on why a man like Harding was gunned down in cold blood. Miller had a list of people to speak to, people who might have been close to Harding, people who might have known him well. He decided to start with the people closest to Harding's business life, particularly his executive team. They were the ones who had the most to gain or lose from Harding's death. The first name on the list was Samantha Carter, Harding's personal attorney. She was in her early 30s, sharp, driven, and known for her meticulous attention to detail. Miller had heard that she had been involved in several high-profile legal battles with Harding, handling everything from acquisitions to potential lawsuits. If anyone knew Harding's business dealings inside and out, it was her. Miller arranged to meet her at a downtown cafe, one of those quiet upscale places where business deals were made over cappuccinos. As he entered the cafe, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled his nostrils, offering a momentary reprieve from the harshness of the world outside. He spotted Samantha immediately, a tall woman with sharp features and auburn hair, her focus entirely on the laptop screen in front of her. She looked up as Miller approached, her expression polite but unreadable. "Detective Miller," she said, extending her hand, which he shook firmly. "I suppose you want to ask me about Richard." Miller took a seat across from her. "Yes, I'm afraid so. I know he was your client, but I need to ask you a few questions about his personal and professional life. We're looking into his death, and any information you can provide will help." Samantha closed her laptop with a soft click, her eyes steady and calculating. "I understand. What do you want to know?" "I want to start with Harding Enterprises. What kind of man was Richard Harding? What was his business like?" Samantha folded her arms, leaning back slightly in her chair. Richard was a complicated man. He was brilliant, no doubt about it. He built that company from the ground up, and he made a household name. But he wasn't easy to work with. He had a vision, and he expected everyone around him to follow it without question. His attitude toward the company was often cutthroat. If someone didn't fall in line, they were out. No second chances. It's a shame, really. He was a good businessman, but his personal relationships were always strained. Miller listened carefully, absorbing her words. It didn't sound like the kind of man who would make a lot of friends, but he was good at what he did. And in the world of business, that often outweighed everything else. You said his personal relationships were strained. Did he have any enemies? Miller pressed. Samantha hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. Richard didn't exactly make friends easily, but I wouldn't say he had any true enemies. I mean, there were people who disliked him, sure. He had some legal battles and disagreements over business deals, but no one who would want to kill him. At least, not that I know of. Miller leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. What about Philip Monroe? Samantha stiffened at the mention of the name. Philip Monroe was the chief financial officer at Harding Enterprises. By all accounts, Monroe was a quiet, reserved man, someone who preferred to stay in the background. But he was also a key player in Harding's empire, and from what Miller had heard, he and Harding had often clashed over the direction of the company. "What about Monroe?" Samantha asked, her voice slightly colder. "I've been hearing some things, that there may have been some tension between the two of them. That Monroe might have had his own agenda." Samantha's eyes flickered with something. Fear, perhaps, or something else. But she quickly masked it with a forced smile. Philip Monroe is a professional. He's been with Harding Enterprises for years. Sure, they had their differences, but that's business. They always work things out. There's no reason to believe that Monroe had anything to do with Richard's death. Miller wasn't convinced. There was something about Monroe that didn't sit right with him. But he needed more than just gut instinct. He needed proof. And he wasn't about to let this go just yet. "Do you know if Richard was involved in anything outside of his business dealings?" Miller asked, his voice low. "Any personal issues? Anyone who might have had a reason to harm him?" Samantha's gaze drifted away from him for a moment, as if she was weighing her words carefully. Richard wasn't exactly the type of man who shared his personal life with others. He kept his private affairs very private. But there were rumors. Rumors about some questionable financial dealings, some off-the-books transactions. I never asked, but I'm sure he was involved in things that weren't exactly above board. But like I said, I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. Miller felt the weight of her words. Harding's business wasn't as clean-cut as it appeared. There were whispers of shady dealings, of money flowing into accounts that shouldn't have been touched, of secret meetings with people whose names were never written down in official records. These were the kinds of things that could ruin an empire, if anyone found out. "You think Harding knew about these questionable dealings?" Miller asked. Samantha nodded slowly. "Edel, I think Richard was always one step ahead of everyone else. He knew more than he let on, and he was starting to dig into some of those things, to uncover some things that he didn't want anyone to know. Things..." Miller pressed that Samantha's eyes narrowed. "I don't know exactly. I wasn't privy to those details. But if Richard had decided to go public with what he knew, it would have destroyed everything." Miller stood up, his mind racing with the new information. This wasn't just a business dispute or a case of corporate greed. Richard Harding had known something dangerous, and someone had killed him to keep it quiet. The real question now was, who had the most to lose? "Thank you, Ms. Carter," Miller said, his voice firm. "I'll be in touch if I need anything else." As he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of Samantha's expression, a mixture of concern and resignation. It was clear that she knew more than she was letting on. But the pieces were starting to fall into place. The trail was getting warmer. Outside the cafe, the snow continued to fall, but Miller didn't feel the cold. His thoughts were consumed with one name, Philip Monroe. He needed to speak to him to get to the bottom of this, because the more Miller thought about it, the more he was certain that Monroe had a lot to answer for. The thin edge of deception, the sun had barely risen over the horizon, but Detective John Miller was already deep into his second cup of black coffee at the precinct. The morning air was still crisp, the remnants of the night's snowstorm hanging like frost on the windows. Outside, the city had settled into its routine, but Miller knew that the stillness was only the calm before the storm. His mind raced with the information he had gathered over the past few days. Richard Harding's murder was no ordinary case. It was tangled with financial webs, corporate secrets, and dangerous people who would do anything to keep those secrets buried. The more Miller delved into Harding's past, the more he realized that his death wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a calculated, deliberate move designed to silence someone who knew too much. The morning after his conversation with Samantha Carter, Miller had been back at the scene, digging for more clues. He'd spoken with a medical examiner, who confirmed that Harding's time of death had likely been sometime in the early hours of the morning, around 2 a.m. The car where Harding had been found was parked in a quiet part of town, far from the bustling streets he was known to frequent. There had been no sign of a struggle, and no indication of forced entry into the car. Whoever had killed Harding had done so with cold precision. But it wasn't just the murder itself that intrigued Miller. It was what Harding had been involved in. The mysterious bank card found near the body, the whispers of hidden financial transactions, the rumors of illicit deals with international criminal organizations. There was something much bigger at play here. Harding's empire wasn't just built on legitimate retail business. It was founded on layers of corruption, secrecy, and possible criminal ties that no one had ever dared to question. And then there was Philip Monroe. Miller had met with several of Harding's closest associates, but Monroe's name kept coming up. The more Miller investigated, the more it seemed that Monroe was at the center of this web. He was the CFO of Harding Enterprises, but he had been far more than just an accountant. Monroe had been the gatekeeper to Harding's fortune, and Miller suspected that he knew more about Harding's dealings than he had let on. The cold, calculating way that Monroe had dismissed the idea of being involved in Harding's murder only made Miller more suspicious. Monroe was the key, but Miller had to find a way to get to him without tipping his hand. He needed to be careful. People like Monroe weren't easily intimidated. They played the long game, hiding in the shadows, manipulating events from behind the scenes. If Miller wanted answers, he would have to approach this investigation with the same level of cunning. That afternoon, Miller received a call from his partner, Detective Laura Stevens. She had been working on tracking down any leads related to Harding's financial records, and her voice on the phone was tinged with urgency. "Miller, I think you need to see this," she said. "I've been going through Harding's transactions over the last 6 months, and there's a lot more going on than we thought. I found something, a series of wire transfers to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The account is linked to a company called Terra Global Investments. It's a shell corporation, but the people behind it, they're not clean. This company is connected to organized crime, money laundering, and arms deals." Miller's pulse quickened. This was it, the break he'd been waiting for. If the money trail led to Terra Global Investments, it would connect Harding to some very dangerous people. And Monroe had been involved with the financial side of things, meaning he had to be connected too. "Where's the account?" Miller asked, his voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline. "I've already sent the details to your email," Laura replied. "But here's the kicker, there's more. One of the transfers was signed off by none other than Philip Monroe. We've got him tied to these transactions, and that's not all. The last transfer was made just a few days before Harding was killed." Miller felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Monroe had been moving money, large sums, through a network of shell companies and off-the-books accounts, all while maintaining his position as the CFO of Harding Enterprises. The walls were closing in on him, but Miller couldn't let himself get complacent. There was still a lot of work to be done, and he needed to make sure he had all his facts straight before confronting Monroe. "I'm on my way," Miller said, hanging up the phone. He grabbed his coat and headed out of the precinct. It was time to pay Monroe a visit. The cold wind bit at Miller's face as he made his way through the snow-covered streets of downtown Chicago. He was beginning to feel the weight of the case settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about finding a murderer. It was about uncovering a conspiracy that had been carefully hidden for years. And somewhere in that tangled mess of lies and corruption, Philip Monroe held the answers. When Miller arrived at the sleek, modern office building where Monroe worked, he was greeted by a receptionist who looked at him with a mixture of suspicion and indifference. After confirming his identity, she informed him that Monroe was in a meeting but would be free shortly. Miller had expected as much. Monroe was a busy man, and people like him didn't like to be interrupted. But Miller didn't have time to wait around. He needed answers, and he needed them now. After a short wait, a door opened, and Philip Monroe stepped out of an office, adjusting his suit jacket. He was a tall man, with an air of quiet authority that radiated from him. His neatly combed hair and sharp features gave him the appearance of someone who was always in control. His eyes narrowed as he spotted Miller standing in the lobby. "Detective Miller," Monroe said smoothly, offering a hand. "I wasn't expecting you." Miller shook his hand, his grip firm. "I'm sure you weren't, but I have some questions about Richard Harding." Monroe's face remained impassive, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes. Nervousness, perhaps, or frustration. "Harding's death was a tragedy, Detective. I can assure you that I had nothing to do with it." Miller didn't buy it for a second. "We'll see about that. I have some questions about your involvement with certain financial transactions. Specifically, wire transfers to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Transfers linked to Terra Global Investments." Monroe's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened imperceptibly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you do," Miller shot back. "You signed off on the transfers, Monroe. I have the paperwork. And it seems your company's CFO has a little too much involvement with criminal organizations for my liking." Monroe's eyes flickered briefly, but he quickly regained his composure. "I've been with Harding Enterprises for over a decade, Detective. I've handled all of our company's financial dealings. That includes dealing with offshore accounts for tax purposes and international investments. There's nothing illegal about that." Miller leaned in slightly, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't care about tax loopholes, Monroe. I care about murder. And right now, you're suspect. You and Harding had some serious issues, didn't you? Financial disagreements, power struggles. You had everything to lose if he started talking about what he knew." Monroe's calm facade cracked for a moment, his eyes narrowing in irritation. "I don't know what you think you're insinuating, Detective, but I had no reason to kill Richard Harding. He was my boss. He paid me handsomely for my work. I don't need to kill someone to get ahead. But you do have a lot to gain if Harding's secrets stay buried," Miller pressed. "You were moving money, Monroe. You were part of something big. And when Harding started to ask questions that could ruin everything, you decided he had to go. Is that it?" For a long moment, Monroe said nothing. He seemed to be weighing his options, calculating his next move. But in the end, he spoke. "I don't know what you think you're going to find, Detective, but I didn't kill Richard Harding. And I'll be happy to cooperate fully with your investigation." He turned to walk back toward his office, but Miller stopped him. "I'm not done with you yet, Monroe. Not by a long shot." Monroe paused, but didn't turn around. "You'll be disappointed, Detective. I have nothing to hide." As Miller walked away from Monroe's office, the pieces were starting to fall into place, but he wasn't finished yet. He knew Monroe was lying, and the more Miller thought about it, the more he realized that Harding's death wasn't just about money. It was about power, control over something far more dangerous than just a few shady transactions. Whoever had killed Richard Harding had done so to protect something far more valuable than money. The question was, what? Miller knew he had to dig deeper. This case was far from over, and Monroe was only one piece of the puzzle. The truth was out there, but it was buried beneath layers of deception, and Miller was determined to uncover every last secret, no matter the cost. Beneath the surface detective, John Miller sat in his car outside the sleek, glass-walled offices of Harding Enterprises, staring at the building with growing suspicion. His fingers drummed rhythmically against the steering wheel, his mind spinning with the threads of evidence he had gathered. The air inside his car felt thick with anticipation. Each piece of the puzzle seemed to lead to one conclusion. Richard Harding's death was far more than just a corporate rivalry gone wrong. There was something bigger at play, something much darker, but Monroe's denial still echoed in Miller's mind. I had nothing to do with it. The words were smooth, practiced, but they didn't ring true. The way Monroe had reacted, calm, almost too calm, told Miller that there was more to the story. People like Monroe didn't get to the top without stepping on a few bodies along the way. And Miller was starting to think that Monroe's hands were stained with blood. But what exactly had Monroe done? Miller had learned a lot about Monroe over the last few days. The CFO had been with Harding Enterprises for nearly 2 decades, and his influence over the company's financial dealings was vast. He was the one who had signed off on the wire transfers to the offshore account. He had authorized money laundering transactions. And there was the matter of the shell corporation, Terra Global Investments, which had deep ties to criminal organizations. But as Miller sat there, looking at the cold, glass exterior of the building, he knew that Monroe wasn't working alone. It wasn't just about the money or the offshore accounts. Harding had been a man with a vision, and someone had been willing to kill to keep that vision from coming to light. Miller had one more lead to follow: Harding's personal assistant, Clara Jensen. According to the staff at Harding Enterprises, Clara had been close to Harding, closer than anyone else, even though she wasn't executive. She knew the ins and outs of his personal life, his day-to-day decisions, and possibly even the threats he had been facing. If anyone had an inkling of why Harding was killed, it was Clara. Miller had arranged to meet her that afternoon at a cafe near the river. It was a quiet place, tucked away from the crowds, where people came to have meetings in peace. As Miller entered the cafe, he spotted Clara sitting at a corner table. She was a petite woman in her early 30s, with short, dark hair and a sharp, calculating look in her eyes. When she saw him, she gave a small nod, her lips curling into a faint, almost sad smile. "Detective Miller," she said, standing to greet him. "I was wondering when you'd come around." Miller smiled back politely, but his mind was already racing. "Clara, thanks for meeting me. I know this isn't easy, but I need to ask you some questions about Richard. Anything you can tell me will help." Clara took her seat again, her eyes flicking nervously to the door before returning to Miller. "I understand. I don't know what you think you'll find. Richard was a good man. He had his flaws, like everyone does, but he didn't deserve this." Miller sat down across from her, leaning in slightly. "I'm not here to judge Richard, Clara. I just need the truth. What was going on behind closed doors at Harding Enterprises? There's something I'm not seeing, something that goes beyond the business side of things." Clara looked down at her hands for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts. Richard was complicated. He built the company from nothing, and he was proud of that. But he didn't always make the best decisions. He had enemies, Detective. People who wanted to see him fail. People who didn't like the way he did things. Miller raised an eyebrow. Enemies? Who? Clara hesitated, glancing around the cafe as if checking to see if anyone was listening. I don't know all the details, but Richard had been dealing with some people from the outside. He'd been meeting with a few shady individuals over the last couple of months. I don't know their names, but I know they weren't business people. They were more like enforcers. I don't know what he was getting involved in, but I could tell he was nervous. He started taking more precautions, changing his routine, hiring extra security. He even talked about selling off part of the company to get out from under whatever it was he was dealing with. But I think it was too late. Miller felt his stomach churn. This was the first time he had heard mention of threats outside the company. If Richard Harding had been in debt to the wrong people, if he had been involved in some criminal dealings, that could explain why he had been targeted. But there was still something missing. Clara was holding back. He could see it in her eyes. "Clara," Miller said gently, "I need you to be honest with me. Was Richard involved in anything illegal? Did he owe money to anyone? Was there something more going on than just business?" Clara took a deep breath and then looked up at Miller, her eyes wide with fear. I don't know for sure. But I think Richard was involved in something bigger than any of us knew. Something dangerous. He was meeting with people who I don't think had his best interests at heart. I didn't want to ask questions. I didn't want to know, but I could tell he was getting in over his head. Miller's mind was racing. This was it, the confirmation he had been waiting for. Harding had been involved in something more than just business dealings. He had been tied to something dangerous, something that had eventually led to his death. "Do you think Monroe knew about this?" Miller asked, his voice low. Clara flinched at the mention of Monroe's name. Monroe? He was Richard's right-hand man. Of course, he knew. He handled all the company's finances, but I think he knew more than that. I overheard some conversations between the two of them, and there were times when Richard seemed afraid of Monroe. It was like Monroe had some kind of power over him. I don't know exactly what happened, but I think Monroe was involved in whatever Richard was trying to get out of. And now Richard's dead. Clara's voice cracked as she spoke, and Miller could see the weight of her guilt. She was blaming herself for not speaking up sooner, for not asking the right questions when she had the chance. But this wasn't the time for self-blame. Miller needed facts, and Clara had given him more than he had expected. "I need you to think carefully, Clara," Miller said, his voice firm but compassionate. "Do you know if Richard ever made any plans to go to the authorities? Did he mention anything about going public with what he knew?" Clara's eyes darkened, and she shook her head slowly. "No, Richard didn't trust the police. He didn't trust anyone outside of his circle. He thought the only way to deal with things was to handle it on his own. But he was scared. I could see it in his eyes. He was afraid of what would happen if he didn't get out. I think he was planning to leave the country." Miller leaned back in his chair, processing her words. "Do you have any idea who these people were that Richard was meeting with? Anything at all?" Clara's face twisted with fear. "I don't know their names, but one of them was connected to the Russian mob. I overheard Richard talking about it once. He said he was in too deep, that he couldn't get out, but he was trying. I think that's why he was so desperate. He wanted to protect the company, protect the people who worked for him. But I don't think he ever realized how dangerous it was. He was playing a game with people who don't play by the rules." Miller felt a shiver run down his spine. The Russian mob, that was the kind of name that could turn a murder investigation into an international crisis. But the pieces were falling into place now. The offshore accounts, the wire transfers, the connections to organized crime. It all pointed to one thing. Richard Harding had been involved in something far beyond his control. And now someone was willing to kill, to keep it hidden. That Clara's voice broke through Miller's thoughts. "Detective, I am sorry. I didn't mean to get you involved in all of this. I didn't know who else to turn to." Miller stood up, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You did the right thing, Clara. You gave me what I needed. Now, I'll do my best to make sure Richard's death wasn't in vain." As Miller left the cafe, he felt the weight of the investigation pressing down on him. Harding's murder was no longer just a business dispute. It was a tangled web of criminal activity, corporate greed, and international power plays. And at the center of it all was Philip Monroe. The deeper Miller dug, the more dangerous the case became. But he wasn't about to back down now that he had one mission: find the truth, no matter where it led. In the shadow of giants, the early evening sky was a bruised shade of purple as Detective John Miller made his way to the gritty industrial district on the outskirts of Chicago. His car's headlights cut through the growing darkness, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. He had just left the precinct after hours of sifting through the latest information Clara Jensen had given him. The deeper he dug into Harding Enterprises' dealings, the more the case seemed to be unraveling into something far darker than he had initially anticipated. Harding's murder wasn't simply about corporate greed or a bitter rivalry. It was about power, control, and survival. People in positions like Harding's rarely had clean hands. Miller had seen it before. The wealthy, the powerful, the influential, they all had their secrets. But Harding had been walking a dangerous tightrope, and now he was dead. The people who wanted him gone were playing a game with high stakes, and the consequences of failure were deadly. Monroe was still the prime suspect, but Miller had a nagging feeling that there were more players involved. Clara had mentioned the Russian mob, and that had sent Miller down a new, terrifying path. If Harding had been involved with them, things were about to get a lot more complicated. The Russians didn't leave loose ends. If they thought Harding knew too much, they would have killed him in a way that made it look like an accident. But the car, the clean execution, it was a message. Whoever had killed Harding had sent a clear signal that they controlled the narrative. A.S. Miller pulled up to the address Clara had provided, an old, abandoned warehouse near the docks. He felt a sense of unease settle in his chest. It wasn't the first time he had chased down a lead to a dead-end building, but this one felt different. There was something ominous about the place. As if the shadows themselves were watching him, he parked the car and stepped out, the chill of the evening air biting into his skin. The streets were eerily quiet, the distant hum of the city's nightlife muffled by the looming warehouses. The building in front of him was dilapidated, its windows boarded up, the paint peeling from its rusted metal doors. A small flickering light inside told him that the building wasn't entirely abandoned. Someone was here, someone who didn't want to be found. Miller adjusted his coat, his hand instinctively moving toward the gun holstered at his side. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and tonight they were screaming at him. This was no longer just an investigation into a corporate murder. He was walking into the lion's den, and the people inside were likely to do whatever it took to protect their secrets. With one last glance around the desolate street, Miller approached the entrance. He knocked on the door, the sound of his knuckles against the metal echoing in the empty space. For a moment, there was nothing, no movement, no sound. Then, a faint shuffle from inside, followed by a low, gravelly voice. "Who's there?" Miller didn't flinch. He had prepared for this. "Detective Miller, I'm here to ask a few questions. About Richard Harding." There was a long pause before the door creaked open just enough to reveal a pair of piercing eyes. The man who stood in the doorway was older, with a weathered face and a thick beard. His eyes were cold and calculating, and Miller could tell immediately that he wasn't someone who would give up information easily. "Come in," the man said curtly, stepping aside. Miller entered cautiously, his eyes scanning the dimly lit interior of the warehouse. The place smelled of mildew and rust, the air thick with the scent of old machinery and damp wood. The man led him into a back room, where a single lamp hung overhead, casting harsh shadows on the concrete floor. The only furniture was a worn table with a few scattered chairs. A large man sat in one of them, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes locked onto Miller with an intensity that suggested he didn't trust the detective one bit. Miller didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You knew Richard Harding. I need to know what you know about him, about the people he was involved with." The older man's eyes flickered briefly, but his face remained impassive. "Richard Harding? Yeah, I knew him. Worked with him a few times. What's this about?" "I'm investigating his murder," Miller replied, his voice firm. "Harding was involved in something dangerous, something that could have gotten him killed. I need to know what it was." The man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but didn't answer right away. He exchanged a glance with the other man, who still hadn't moved, his eyes unreadable. Finally, the older man spoke. Harding wasn't the kind of guy who ran with the wrong crowd, but he wasn't an angel either. He got mixed up with some bad people. The Russians, mostly. We all knew that. But he was smart. He knew how to keep his distance. At least he thought he did. Miller narrowed his eyes. The Russians? Who exactly was he dealing with? The older man hesitated again. "I can't say for sure. We weren't exactly friends. But I know enough to know that when you're dealing with them, you don't ask too many questions. You just do your job and keep your head down." Miller's patience was wearing thin. "You're telling me you don't know who he was working with? You don't know what was going on behind the scenes?" The man looked at the other man in the corner, who finally spoke. "I know a little. You're looking at this all wrong. Harding wasn't just making deals with the Russians. He was trying to get out. He was trying to leave the business. But the people he was involved with didn't let people walk away that easily." Miller's interest peaked. Who were these people? What do they want from him? The older man sighed deeply, as if the weight of the secret was too much to bear. They wanted control. Harding had something they wanted, something valuable. But it wasn't just about money. It was about power, detective. These guys, they don't care about wealth. They care about power. And they'll kill anyone who stands in their way. Miller processed the information, his mind racing. It wasn't just money that had gotten Harding killed. It was something much bigger. Someone had wanted him silenced. Not for the wealth he controlled, but for the influence he could wield. Whoever had killed him wasn't just protecting financial interests. They were eliminating a threat. The man continued, his voice low and strained. The Russians weren't the only ones after him. Monroe, Philip Monroe, he was involved too. He was on their payroll, helping them launder money through Harding Enterprises. Harding was in too deep, and Monroe was trying to keep it all under control. But things started to fall apart. And once they did, Monroe started looking for a way out too. Miller's heart sank. "Monroe?" "Yeah," the man said, his voice thick with contempt. Monroe wasn't just Harding's CFO. He was the one who made sure the money got to the right places. He was involved in the whole damn thing. But he wasn't the one who killed Harding. Someone else did. Someone higher up. Monroe was just a tool. He knew enough to stay alive, but not enough to make him a threat. Miller stood still, digesting the information. Monroe was still the linchpin. He was involved, no question. But now it seemed that there were even deeper, more dangerous people behind the murder. The Russians were a part of it, but someone else had made sure that Harding never lived to see the end of his plan to get out. Who else was involved? Miller asked quietly. The older man shook his head. "I don't know names. I only know what I heard. People don't talk about this stuff. But I can tell you one thing, detective. If you keep pushing, you're going to get yourself killed. These people don't stop. They never stop." Miller felt the weight of those words settle into his chest like a stone. He had been in this business long enough to know when someone was telling the truth. This wasn't just a case about a corporate murder. This was a case about power, manipulation, and a dangerous network of people who would stop at nothing to protect what they had built. And Monroe, Philip Monroe, was at the center of it all. S. Miller left the warehouse. The cold air hit him with a biting force. The city seemed quieter now, the streets more deserted. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, but Miller knew the hardest part was still ahead. Monroe was only a small part of a much larger, more dangerous game, and Miller had just scratched the surface. He had to find out who the real players were before it was too late. He had to make sure that Richard Harding's death wasn't in vain, and he would stop at nothing to do it. The web unravels. Detective John Miller sat at his desk, staring at the black and white photographs spread out before him. They were images of Richard Harding's office, his private residence, the buildings associated with Harding Enterprises, all seemingly mundane in their stillness. But in each photograph, Miller saw something more. Patterns, connections, things he had missed before. The case had evolved in ways he hadn't expected. It had started with the seemingly straightforward murder of a corporate executive, but now it was entangled in a dangerous game of power and control that spanned continents. People were dying because of a far-reaching conspiracy, and the closer Miller got to the truth, the more he realized just how high the stakes were. Monroe was still the prime suspect, But Miller's gut told him there was more to this story. There were too many unanswered questions, too many people involved. The Russian mob, the shell companies, the vast financial networks stretching far beyond Chicago. This was not just a murder investigation. This was about exposing a criminal underworld with ties to corporate greed, political influence, and international crime that Miller's thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of his phone. He glanced at the caller ID and saw that it was Lieutenant Hannah Webb, his superior. She had been in charge of the initial investigation into Harding's death before Miller took the lead. Their relationship had been professional, though Webb wasn't always thrilled about Miller's unconventional methods. She was by the book, and he had learned long ago to color outside the lines when the situation called for it. "Detective Miller," he answered. "Where are you?" Webb's voice was tight, almost urgent. "I need you to get down to the office. We got a lead. It's about Harding's murder, and it's bigger than we thought." Miller's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, bigger?" "Just get here," Webb said, and then the line went dead. Miller stood up, his mind racing. A new lead. This could be the break he'd been waiting for. He grabbed his jacket and headed out the door, his mind running through the possibilities. What new piece of the puzzle could have surfaced? What had Webb found? As he made his way to the precinct, his thoughts turned back to the photographs on his desk. He had been looking for something, a pattern in the chaos of Harding's life. But maybe it wasn't about finding the right clue. It was about understanding who was pulling the strings and why. When Miller arrived at the precinct, he was greeted by Webb in the bullpen. She was pacing, looking more agitated than he had ever seen her. The walls were lined with corkboards and pin-ups of potential leads, but nothing seemed to hold the clarity Miller had been searching for. Webb stopped pacing when she saw him, and for a moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them. "Talk to me, Lieutenant," Miller said, his voice calm, even as his mind raced with questions. Webb led him to her office, shutting the door behind him. "We've got something big," she said, her eyes scanning the room nervously. She handed him a manila envelope, and Miller tore it open. Inside were several documents, each filled with names, dates, and amounts of money transferred across various accounts. Some of the names were familiar: Monroe, Harding, and even Claire Jensen, but others were not. "These are offshore accounts," Webb explained, pointing to the documents. "We traced some of the transactions back to a company called Eastmark Trading. It's a front for a larger operation, an international criminal syndicate. These people aren't just doing small-time money laundering. They're moving large sums across the globe. And we found links to the Russian mob." Miller's eyes widened as he studied the documents. "So Harding was more involved in this than we thought." "Not just involved," Webb said, her voice growing more serious. "Harding was the key player. The Russians were using him to funnel money through Harding Enterprises, and now we've found evidence that Monroe was working with them, too. The whole thing was a setup from the start." Miller felt a chill run down his spine. He had known the case was more complex than a simple murder, but this was something else entirely. So Monroe wasn't just a bystander. He was in on it. He's been helping the Russians from the inside. Webb nodded. "That's what it looks like. But there's more. We've got a name, Viktor Ivanov. He's the man who's been running the operation. He's been tied to some of the biggest criminal organizations in Eastern Europe, and he's got a direct link to the Russian government. We think Ivanov was the one who called the shots, and Harding was either going to get out or be eliminated. Monroe, of course, was caught in the middle." Miller processed this new information, the weight of it sinking in. This was bigger than a murder investigation. It was a matter of international politics, organized crime, and corporate corruption all wrapped into one. How does Ivanov fit into the murder? Did he order Harding's death? Webb hesitated before answering. "We don't know for sure, but the money trail we've been following leads back to Ivanov. It looks like he was involved in everything, from the offshore accounts to the murder. He knew Harding was trying to extricate himself from the deal, and that made him a liability. Miller took a deep breath. He had been right about one thing. Harding's death had been about more than just money. It had been about control. Ivanov and his syndicate needed to maintain that control, and Harding's decision to back out had made him expendable. But Monroe, Miller asked, his voice low, what role did he play in all of this? Was he just a middleman? Webb shook her head. Monroe was more than that. He was integral to the operation. He knew about the money laundering, the offshore accounts, the fake investments. He helped keep the operation under wraps. He might not have pulled the trigger, but he was complicit. Miller's mind was working at full speed now. The picture was becoming clearer, but there were still so many pieces missing. Why had Harding decided to break away from the operation? Had he realized the extent of the danger he was in? And why hadn't Monroe taken steps to cover his tracks more carefully? We need to find Ivanov, Miller said, his voice firm. He's the key, but Monroe's going to be a problem. He's not going to go down without a fight. Webb nodded. I'll make the arrangements for the international arrest warrant, but you need to be careful. Ivanov's people are everywhere. This won't be easy. Miller left the precinct with a new sense of purpose. He now had the full scope of the conspiracy, Monroe, the Russian mob, the money laundering operation. The picture was finally coming together, but the danger was escalating. Ivanov was not just a businessman. He was a criminal mastermind, and he wouldn't let anyone stand in his way. Monroe, too, was a significant player. If they couldn't get to him first, he would vanish into the shadows, just like Harding had tried to. The next morning, Miller and his team were back at the scene of the crime, Harding's penthouse apartment. They had gone through it before, but something was telling Miller to take another look. The room felt different now, like a key was waiting to be found. He spent hours combing through Harding's personal effects, his papers, his files. There had to be something that connected all the dots. To the end of the day, when Miller was about to call it quits, he noticed something unusual, a small, locked drawer in Harding's desk that he had missed previously. It wasn't a safe, but it was secure. A few moments later, Miller had it open. Inside was a folder, a thick one, filled with documents. But what caught his eye wasn't just the papers. It was a single photograph on top. It was a picture of Richard Harding shaking hands with Viktor Ivanov. It was taken at an undisclosed location, but the look in Harding's eyes was unmistakable. He had been in too deep, and now, it seemed, there was no way out that Miller's breath caught in his throat. This was it, the final piece of the puzzle. Harding hadn't been just another victim of the Russian mob. He had been a participant, but now he had wanted out, and that was why he was dead. The file also contained a series of documents outlining a final deal that Harding had been negotiating, something big enough to bring down the entire operation. It was no wonder someone had killed him. He had been a liability, and he had known too much. A.S. Miller stood in the apartment, holding the folder. He realized that the hunt was only just beginning. Ivanov and Monroe were still out there, and they would stop at nothing to keep their secrets safe. But Miller was determined to stop them, no matter what it took. Shadows in the dark, the night was thick with tension as Detective John Miller sat in his car outside a dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The wind howled, rattling the broken windows of the nearby buildings, but Miller barely noticed. His mind was racing, his thoughts swirling around the events that had brought him here. The file he had found in Harding's apartment had been a game changer. It contained the final pieces of a puzzle that had been in the making for years. Viktor Ivanov, the shadowy figure at the center of the Russian syndicate, was not only involved in money laundering, but also had connections to a far-reaching network of criminal enterprises. The documents outlined a massive deal between Ivanov and a mysterious group, something that could send shockwaves through the global underworld. But it wasn't just the syndicate that Miller was after now. It was Monroe. Philip Monroe had known Harding, had worked with him, and now he was implicated in everything from money laundering to murder. Miller's gut told him that Monroe was hiding something far more dangerous than what he had already uncovered. He glanced at the time on the dashboard. Almost midnight. It had been a long day, and the hours stretched ahead like a never-ending road. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this warehouse was the key to everything. Clara Jensen's earlier warning echoed in his mind. You don't know who you're dealing with, Miller. These people play a much bigger game than you realize. Clara had been right. Ivanov, Monroe, the syndicate wasn't just about the money or the power. It was about control. And Miller was in the middle of it, caught between dangerous players who would stop at nothing to protect their empire. Taking a deep breath, Miller stepped out of the car and pulled his coat tight against the chill. The city was quiet tonight, as if holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The warehouse loomed before him, its silhouette barely visible against the dim streetlights. The door was slightly ajar, and Miller could make out the faint sounds of movement from inside. Low voices, the shuffle of boots on concrete. His hand instinctively went to the gun holstered at his side. This wasn't just a routine investigation anymore. It wasn't about uncovering corporate fraud or corruption. This was about survival. His survival. Miller pushed the door open and stepped inside, the creak of the hinges loud in the silence. The warehouse was cavernous, the high ceilings lost in shadows. The only light came from a few overhead bulbs, casting flickering pools of yellow light onto the cracked floor. A few crates were stacked haphazardly against the walls, and the smell of rust and old machinery hung heavy in the air. He moved cautiously, each step deliberate. The voices grew louder as he crept deeper into the warehouse, careful not to make sound. As he rounded a corner, he saw them. 3 men, all dressed in dark clothes, standing around a table. Maps, documents, and several stacks of cash were spread out before them. One of the men, tall and broad-shouldered, was speaking in Russian. The other 2 nodded, their faces expressionless. Miller didn't need to understand the language to know that they were talking about something serious. His instinct screamed that this was connected to Ivanov's operation, and that whatever they were planning could spell disaster. Before he could take another step, a voice cut through the silence, sharp and commanding. Detective Miller, I presume? Miller froze. The voice was familiar. Too familiar, he turned to see a figure stepping out from the shadows, his silhouette illuminated by the flickering lights. It was Philip Monroe. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Monroe's face was hard, cold, his eyes dark and calculating. He hadn't expected to see the man so soon, but now it made sense. Monroe had been working with Ivanov, and if he was here, it meant things were escalating. What the hell are you doing here, Monroe? Miller asked, his voice low but steady. Monroe didn't answer immediately. He took a slow step forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied Miller, sizing him up. Then, without warning, he let out a low laugh. You think you can just waltz into this place and take everything down, don't you, detective? Miller's grip tightened on his gun, but he kept it at his side. He wasn't here for a shootout, not yet at least. I'm here for answers. About Harding, about you, about Ivanov. Monroe's face twisted into a mocking smile. Answers? You won't get them from me, and you certainly won't get them from Ivanov. Miller stepped closer, narrowing the distance between them. I don't think you realize what you're dealing with, Monroe. You're in way over your head. This whole thing, Harding's death, the money laundering, the syndicate, it's all coming to an end. And if you don't start talking, you're going to be caught in the middle of it. Monroe's expression shifted, the mockery replaced by something colder. You're wrong, detective. You think you're playing the hero, but you don't understand the game. This isn't just about money. It's about power, and people like you. He gestured toward Miller. People like you don't get to decide who wins. Miller felt a chill creep up his spine. There was something in Monroe's eyes, something dangerous. Monroe wasn't just protecting himself. He was protecting something much bigger. The sound of a door creaking open interrupted their exchange, and Miller's attention snapped toward the noise. A man walked in the dim light, tall, imposing, with dark eyes that seemed to pierce through the gloom. It was Viktor Ivanov. Miller's heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting this moment, but now that it was here, it felt surreal. Ivanov's presence filled the room, his very aura exuding power and control. He was a man used to getting what he wanted, and right now, what he wanted was to get rid of Miller. Well, Ivanov said, his voice smooth and almost pleasant. "Detective Miller, I've been expecting you." Miller didn't flinch. He stood his ground, staring Ivanov down. "You've been expecting me?" Ivanov smiled coldly. "Of course. I knew this day would come. You've been poking around in places where you don't belong. You've seen too much, and now you're a liability." Miller's fingers itched for his gun, but he kept his composure. "I know about the operation. The money laundering, the offshore accounts, the syndicate. I know about Harding's involvement, and I know you're behind it all." Ivanov's smile didn't fade. Harding was a fool. He thought he could escape, thought he could walk away from something that was far bigger than him. But people like him, people who get too big for their own good, end up like him. He paused, looking at Miller with disdain. Dead. Miller's jaw clenched. He'd been right all along. Harding hadn't been a victim. He had been a player. And now, because of his attempts to extricate himself from a deal, he was dead. "You're not walking away from this, Ivanov," Miller said through gritted teeth. "The law's coming for you, and we're going to take down your entire operation." Ivanov took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving Miller's. "You think you can stop me? Do you really believe that? I control things much bigger than you can imagine. You're just a detective, a small part of a much larger picture, and you're my way." Before Miller could respond, Ivanov made a small gesture, and the two men with him, still standing by the table, moved toward him with alarming speed. Miller's instincts kicked in. He spun around, reaching for his gun, but the two men were too quick. A sharp pain shot through his side as one of them slammed an elbow into his ribs. He staggered, but he managed to pull out his gun and fire a shot in the air. The noise echoed through the warehouse, causing the two men to hesitate. But it was only a brief pause. They lunged for him again. This was it. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. But Miller wasn't going down without a fight. "Call it off." Monroe's voice rang out, cutting through the chaos. "Enough, Ivanov. We don't need to kill him." Ivanov raised an eyebrow, his expression darkening. "You think you can control me, Monroe?" Monroe stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. "This isn't the time. Not yet." The tension in the room hung thick, the air electric with the possibility of violence. Finally, Ivanov made a slow gesture to his men to stand down. Miller, still struggling to catch his breath, glared at them. "This isn't over." Ivanov looked at him, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "No, detective, it's just beginning." The edge of the Abyssthonite air outside the warehouse felt colder than it had before, the biting wind cutting through Miller's jacket as he made his way back to his car. His hands were still trembling, his heart pounding in his chest. The confrontation had been too close, too dangerous, but Miller couldn't afford to back down. Not now. Not after everything he had uncovered, but he knew one thing for certain. Viktor Ivanov was not just a businessman or a criminal mastermind. He was a force, an impenetrable, calculating force that had worked his way into the very fabric of global corruption. And Monroe, despite his bravado, was just another pawn in Ivanov's game. Miller had thought he could use Monroe to crack the case wide open, but now he wasn't so sure. Monroe was just as tangled up in this mess as anyone else, perhaps even more so. Miller slid into his car and slammed the door shut, leaning back against the seat. The muffled sound of the city traffic was the only thing that seemed to break the silence in his head. He could still hear Ivanov's calm, measured voice echoing in his mind. "You're my way, detective, and I don't take kindly to that." That was the threat. That was the truth. The clock on the dashboard flickered to 1:15 a.m. He had to make a move, and fast. Ivanov's empire was vast, and every minute spent chasing dead leads was another minute that the people he was after could slip through his fingers. A Miller's phone buzzed on the passenger seat, breaking his reverie. He reached for it, half expecting it to be Webb, but when he saw the name on the screen, his pulse quickened that IT was Clara Jensen. Miller hesitated for a moment before answering. Her warning from earlier still lingered in his mind, but he couldn't afford to ignore her. Not now. "Jensen," he said, his voice low, careful. "Detective Miller." Clara's voice came through the line, clear but tight. "I need you to listen to me. You're playing a dangerous game, and I don't think you realize just how deep this goes. Ivanov isn't just some thug. He's connected to people you wouldn't believe." "I know," Miller replied. "I've seen the money trails, the connections. He's more than a businessman. He's the head of an entire network." Clara paused on the other end of the line. "No, you don't understand. It's bigger than you think. Ivanov's not just dealing with the Russian mob. He's involved with government officials, high-level ones. And Monroe? He's not just a lackey. He's more powerful than you know. You're digging in places you shouldn't. Miller, you're putting yourself in more danger than you can handle." Miller clenched his jaw. "I don't have a choice. I'm already in this. Harding's dead. Monroe's involved. I can't just walk away." "I'm not telling you to walk away," Clara said, her voice urgent. "But I'm telling you to be careful. There's more at stake here than a murder investigation. There's something much darker lurking underneath all of this. Trust me, you don't want to get any deeper. You're standing on the edge of the abyss." Miller's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "What are you saying, Clara? What's really going on?" She was silent for a long moment, and for the first time, Miller felt the weight of her fear, something he hadn't expected from her. "I can't say much over the phone," she said finally, "but I can help you. Meet me at the old docks on West River. I'll tell you everything, but you have to trust me." Miller thought for a moment. The docks. It was a place he'd been to countless times, mostly for routine cases. But tonight, it felt different. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a crossroads. The kind of crossroads that could define his career and his life. "I'll be there," Miller said. "Give me 20 minutes." After hanging up, Miller started the car and turned the engine over. His mind raced with a million questions. What did Clara know that he didn't? And why'd she been so reluctant to share this information before? Something wasn't adding up, and he was starting to feel like the pieces of this puzzle were slipping away faster than he could catch them. The docks were eerily quiet when Miller arrived. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the river against the shore and the occasional screech of a seagull in the distance. The harsh light from the street lamps cast long, distorted shadows across the deserted pier, making it feel as if the night itself was closing in around him. Miller parked the car and stepped out, scanning the area. Clara was waiting near an old warehouse, her figure barely visible in the dim light. She was alone. As promised, he walked toward her, his boots thudding against the wet pavement. Clara turned as he approached, her face pale but determined. "You made it," she said softly, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the dock, as if she were afraid they were being watched. Miller nodded. "You said you had information. What's going on, Clara?" She took a deep breath, exhaling slowly before speaking. "It's not just Ivanov. He's connected to people much more powerful than you can imagine. I've seen the files. I've seen the names. The network he's a part of, it goes all the way to the top. Not just Russia, but right here in the United States." Miller's stomach tightened. "Who?" Clara shook her head. I can't give you names yet. I don't have the full picture, but what I can tell you is this. Ivanov has been working with high-ranking officials, people who have access to resources that would make even your department look like a joke. He's been using Harding's company as a front to launder money, but there's more to it. The deals they've been making, they're linked to government contracts, military-grade weapons, and even black ops operations. The kind of things that could bring entire governments to their knees if they were exposed. Miller felt a chill run down his spine. He had been thinking in terms of corporate corruption, money laundering, and organized crime. But this was something far more dangerous. You're saying Ivanov and his people have infiltrated the government. I'm not saying infiltrated. I'm saying they've embedded themselves at the highest levels. The real power lies with the people who control the government's purse strings. Ivanov has made deals with them. And Monroe? He's part of it. He's not just a middleman. He's a decision maker. Miller's mind reeled. Monroe, he's deeper in this than I thought. Much deeper, Claire confirmed. And the worst part? Harding didn't want any part of it anymore. He was trying to get out. That's why they killed him. They had to. He knew too much. Miller clenched his fists, trying to process what she was saying. So what's our next move? How do we stop this? Clara hesitated. There's a meeting coming up at the docks in a few days. Ivanov and his people are making another deal. It's all going down here right under our noses. But this time, it's bigger than anything they've done before. If we can stop this deal from happening, we can take down the whole operation. Miller nodded slowly, his mind clicking into overdrive. We'll need backup, and we'll need to be ready for anything. Clara's eyes flickered with uncertainty. I'm not sure we'll have much time. These people don't play by the rules, Miller. They'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves. I know, Miller replied, but I'm not backing down. This ends now. Clara stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. Just be careful. Trust no one, not even me. Miller studied her face, trying to read the expression that flickered in her eyes. Was it fear, or was it something else? Something that told him she knew more than she was letting on. But there was no time for second-guessing. The danger was real. The stakes were too high, and now the clock was ticking. Into the storm, the early morning hours had arrived, and with them, a heavy fog that blanketed the city like a shroud. Detective Miller's mind was as clouded as the streets outside his apartment. The meeting at the docks was only 2 days away, and while he'd managed to piece together the skeleton of Ivanov's empire, the details were still slipping through his fingers like sand. Every step he took felt like he was walking deeper into the abyss. Every lead seemed to circle back to another dead, and he had to move fast, or everything would slip out of reach. Ivanov, Monroe, and the men behind them were all connected to something much larger than simple crime. This was a game of power on a global scale, and Miller wasn't sure he was equipped to handle it. But there was no turning back now. The more he uncovered, the more dangerous it became. He couldn't let fear dictate his actions. Miller stood by the window, staring out at the city skyline. The fog had swallowed the buildings, making the city look like a ghost town. It felt like the calm before the storm. His phone buzzed on the table behind him. It was Clara. He picked it up immediately. "You have something for me?" he asked, trying to sound calm, though his heart was racing. "There's a secondary meeting planned tonight." Clara's voice came through the line, tight with urgency. "Not at the docks, but at an undisclosed location. They're moving product, Miller. And it's not just money. This deal is about something much more dangerous." Miller's pulse quickened. "What kind of product? Guns? Drugs?" "No," Clara responded, her voice shaky. "Worse. They're moving weapons, yes, but also classified tech. Military-grade surveillance systems. Stuff that can track anyone, anywhere in the world. This isn't just a deal for cash, it's for control." Miller's mind raced. This was bigger than he had imagined. Ivanov wasn't just laundering money. He was trafficking in technology that could destabilize entire countries. I need details, Clara. Where's this deal happening? Who's involved? Miller's tone was sharper now, more urgent. I don't have all the answers, but I've tracked the location to an old mansion on the outskirts of the city. It's isolated, but the people there are connected to Ivanov's network. They'll be bringing in shipments, heavy shipments. If you want to stop this, now's your chance. But Miller, you need to be prepared for what you'll find. I'm ready. I'll be there in an hour, he said, his mind already shifting into action. The air outside had thickened, the fog creating an eerie silence as Miller drove through the city's winding streets. He could feel the weight of everything that had led up to this moment pressing down on him. He had no idea what awaited him at the mansion, but Clara's words were burned into his mind. This is bigger than just money as he approached the mansion. The looming silhouette of the building appeared from behind the mist, its ornate stonework barely visible through the haze. The mansion was a relic, its once beautiful facade now cracked and overgrown with ivy. The estate was quiet, but there was a strange energy in the air, like something was waiting just out of sight. Miller parked his car a few blocks away, his nerves tingling with a sense of anticipation. He wasn't alone in this. Clara had arranged for a small team of officers to support him, but the operation was still risky. Even with backup, Miller knew that facing Ivanov's people would be a death sentence if they weren't careful. The men working for Ivanov weren't amateurs. They were soldiers, spies, and criminals with access to weapons that could easily overpower the police. Miller took a deep breath and adjusted his jacket. It was time to get moving. The mansion loomed in front of him as he approached on foot, his every step cautious and deliberate. He had no intention of charging him blindly. It was clear that the stakes had changed. What was at play here wasn't just a murder case. It was a global conspiracy, and if he didn't stop it, the ramifications would be catastrophic. The front gates were locked, but Miller had anticipated that. He ducked around to the side of the mansion and found a small, rusted door leading into what looked like a service entrance. His fingers worked quickly to undo the lock, and with a soft click, the door creaked open. Inside, the mansion was dark and musty, the air thick with mildew and dust. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he moved through the house, every sense on high alert. The place was a maze of corridors and rooms, but Miller had a sense of where he needed to go. Clara's intel had pinpointed the location of the deal, an old study on the second floor, overlooking the grounds. As he ascended the staircase, Miller heard muffled voices ahead, deep, guttural tones speaking in Russian, followed by the clink of metal. The deal was already in motion. He reached the top of the stairs and paused, looking around. The door to the study was just ahead. Miller pulled out his gun, his heart hammering in his chest. His breath was steady, but every instinct told him this was the moment that everything could go wrong. With a soft push, the door swung open. Miller's eyes scanned the room immediately. Two men stood by a large table, inspecting crates marked with foreign symbols. There were no visible weapons, but Miller could feel the danger in the air. The men were talking in low voices, but they stopped when they saw him. "You're too late, Detective," a voice called from the back of the room. Miller's eyes locked onto the figure emerging from the shadows. Viktor Ivanov. "Not too late, Ivanov," Miller said, his voice steady despite the fear that was creeping in. "You're about to answer for everything. All of it." Ivanov's lips curled into a smile, cold and calculating. "Answer for what? You think you're going to stop this? You don't even know what you're up against." Miller didn't flinch. "I know enough to bring you down. This ends tonight." At that moment, Miller heard footsteps approaching from behind him. He turned quickly, but it was too late. A sharp blow to the back of his head sent him crashing to the floor, his vision blurring. Everything went dark. When Miller came to, the first thing he noticed was the sharp pain in his head. His body was sore, and his arms were bound tightly behind him. His legs were cramping from the awkward position, but his mind was focused on one thing. Where was Ivanov? He blinked against the harsh light overhead and tried to make sense of his surroundings. He was no longer in the mansion study. Instead, he was in a small, dimly lit room with concrete floors and peeling walls. It looked like a basement, or perhaps a holding cell. The sound of footsteps echoed, and Miller's eyes snapped to the door. It creaked open, and there, standing in the doorway, was Ivanov. "Well, detective," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "You're resilient, I'll give you that. But you're playing in a game far too large for you. You should have stayed away. Now you've crossed the line." Miller struggled against his restraints, his mind racing for an escape plan. "You can kill me, Ivanov. You can kill anyone, but you'll never get away with this." Ivanov's smile faded, replaced with cold fury. "Already have, Miller. You've already lost." Miller met his gaze, refusing to back down. He wasn't finished yet. He had one card left to play, and it was a big one. The longest night Miller's head was pounding, each throb matching the rhythm of his racing heart. He tried to focus, tried to push the fog from his mind, but the sharp pain in the back of his skull kept pulling him back into the darkness. His arms were still bound tightly behind him, the ropes digging into his skin. He tried to wiggle his wrists free, but it was no use. The ropes were expertly tied, and his struggles only made them tighter. Ivanov was standing just a few feet away, his face impassive, as if he were observing a specimen under a microscope. The two men who had ambushed Miller earlier were now standing guard by the door, their guns hanging loosely at their sides, watching him with cold, calculating eyes. Miller glared at Ivanov, his jaw clenched. This is not the end. He couldn't let it be. "You've got a lot of nerve, detective," Ivanov said, his voice smooth, almost too calm. "You think you can stop me? You think your little investigation matters? What you're up against is far beyond your reach. It's a global network, Miller. You can't just tear it down with a few questions and a couple of lucky shots." "I'm not here to win." Ivanov, Miller spat, his voice raspy. "I'm here to make sure you don't win." Ivanov chuckled darkly, stepping closer to Miller. "You're naive. You don't even know who you're dealing with. I didn't get to where I am by being careless or impulsive. I've built an empire over decades. Governments are involved. Corporations are involved. You're just a small piece in a much larger game, detective." Miller's mind was spinning, but there was one thing he knew for sure. Ivanov's smug confidence was his biggest weakness. If Miller could expose the cracks, find the smallest opening, maybe, just maybe, he could turn the tide. "You're too arrogant, Ivanov," Miller said, his voice gaining strength despite the pain. "You think no one will ever stop you, but you're wrong. You've made too many enemies. There are people out there who will take you down, even if I don't." Ivanov's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Miller could see a flicker of irritation in his gaze. It was subtle, but it was there. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Ivanov said coldly. "And frankly, I'm done with your little speeches. You've outlived your usefulness. It's time to take care of you." He gestured to one of the guards, who approached Miller with a syringe in hand. The man's face was emotionless, his movements mechanical as he prepared to inject whatever poison Ivanov had planned for him. Miller's heart raced. This was it. If he didn't act now, he was dead. With a surge of adrenaline, Miller kicked his legs out and managed to knock the chair he was tied to sideways, sending the syringe flying from the guard's hand. The guard were momentarily caught off guard, and in that split second, Miller threw all his strength into a desperate attempt to break free. "Get him!" Ivanov shouted. The guards lunged, but Miller wasn't about to go down without a fight. Using the momentum from his fall, he twisted his body and slammed his shoulder into one of the guards, knocking him off balance. The second guard grabbed at Miller's legs, but Miller kicked him away with his feet, using every ounce of strength he had left. The pain in his head was blinding, and his arms felt like they were on fire from the ropes, but he kept fighting. The chair scraped across the concrete floor as he scrambled to get to his feet. His mind was screaming, "Think, think, think." Suddenly, a loud crash sounded from the hallway, followed by the unmistakable echo of gunfire. The door to the room flung open, and a figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted by the dim light from the hallway. "Move, Miller," the voice called, sharp and urgent. It was Clara. Without thinking, Miller surged toward her, pulling the knife she had tossed him from the inside of her jacket. With one clean stroke, he sliced through the ropes, binding his hands. The guards were still disoriented from the chaos, but Miller didn't waste a second. He grabbed Clara's arm and pulled her into the room, slamming the door shut behind them. "What the hell are you doing here?" Miller hissed, his voice a mix of gratitude and frustration. "I could ask you the same thing," Clara replied, her breath coming in quick bursts. "You think I was going to let you face Ivanov alone? We've been tracking his movements for weeks. You were just about to make the biggest mistake of your life." Miller looked over at the guards, who were beginning to recover from the confusion. They were still armed and dangerous, and he knew time was running out. "Where's your backup?" he asked. "They're outside, but we need to move quickly," Clara said, glancing nervously at the door. "There's more going on here than just Ivanov. If we don't act now, everything will fall apart." Miller nodded, his mind snapping into gear. Clara had always been a wild card, but she had a solid grasp of what was at stake. She was the ally he needed to bring this down. Without warning, Miller grabbed a nearby chair and hurled it at the door, just as one of the guards reached for the handle. The chair smashed into the door, knocking the man backward. "Go," Miller shouted. He grabbed Clara's arm and pulled her toward the back of the room, where there was a narrow staircase leading down into what appeared to be a basement. They descended quickly, their footsteps heavy and hurried. The sound of shouting from the guards above them echoed down the stairs. They were coming. "Where are we going?" Miller asked, his breath ragged. "There's an escape route," Clara said, urgency in her voice. "A tunnel. It leads to the old docks. From there, we can get you out of here and call for backup." "Lead the way," Miller urged, as he scanned the dimly lit space for any sign of the guards. The passage was cramped and cold, but it was their only chance. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, the muffled sound of footsteps above them faded, replaced by the rush of adrenaline in Miller's veins. They were almost there. "Ivanov's men won't stop," Miller said, his voice low. "They'll come for us the second they realize we've escaped." Clara nodded, but there was something else in her eyes, something darker. "They're not just coming for you, Miller. They'll come for everyone. And once they have you, they won't stop until you're dead. You need to get out of here. The deal's about to go down, and we can't afford to let it happen." "Then we'll stop it," Miller said, a fire lighting in his chest. "We'll stop it together." A race against time, the narrow tunnel seemed to stretch forever, the dim light from their flashlights casting long shadows against the walls. Each step Miller took echoed through the cold concrete, but the noise was drowned out by the steady beat of his heart in his chest. Clara moved ahead, her pace quick, but she kept glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to jump out at them at any moment. Miller's head still throbbed from the blow earlier, but adrenaline had replaced the pain with a sharp, focused clarity. They couldn't afford to waste any time. Every second they spent in the tunnel brought them closer to Ivanov's deal, and the stakes were higher than ever. "Clara, where exactly does this tunnel lead?" Miller asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "To the old docks," she replied, her tone tight. It was part of the mansion's original layout. The owners were involved in smuggling decades ago, They built these tunnels as a way to get shipments in and out without anyone noticing. Ivanov's men use them for the same purpose now. Ivanov's using a mansion for arms deals and tech trafficking. This guy's more ambitious than I thought, Miller muttered, scanning the tunnel ahead of them. The walls were damp, and the air was heavy with mildew, but the further they walked, the more the oppressive silence seemed to press in on them. Something wasn't right. Everything with Ivanov is bigger than you can imagine, Clara said, her voice low. This isn't just about weapons or technology, it's about power. He's built an empire that spans continents. If this deal goes through, it'll change everything. Miller couldn't shake the feeling that they were too late. The urgency in Clara's voice was real, and every part of him screamed that they were about to step into a storm that could swallow them whole. He had no idea what Ivanov's network was really capable of. For all Miller knew, the man was untouchable, and if that was the case, the deal they were racing to stop might already be done before they could even get there. Clara suddenly stopped, her hand shooting out to grip his arm, pulling him back into the shadows. "What is it?" Miller whispered, his body tensing in response to her sudden movement. "I think I heard something," she murmured, peering ahead through the darkness. "Stay low." They both crouched, blending into the shadows as the sound of footsteps echoed down the tunnel. Miller's pulse quickened as he strained to listen. The footsteps weren't coming from behind. They were coming from the direction they were heading. "They've found us," Clara whispered, her eyes widening in realization. "We need to move now." Without waiting for another word, she surged forward, pulling Miller along with her. The footsteps grew louder, and Miller could hear the clanking of boots against metal and stone. Whoever was coming didn't want to be seen, but there was no way out. They were too far into the tunnel to turn back, and even if they did, the guard would catch up to them within minutes. Miller's mind raced. He had no plan, no backup. It was just him and Clara against whatever was waiting on the other side. He had to trust that the tunnel would lead them to safety. He had no choice but to keep moving. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer. Miller could almost feel the presence of the guards behind them, closing in like a trap ready to snap shut. They had to make it to the end of the tunnel, no matter what. Clara reached a thick iron door at the end of the passage, her hand flying to the rusty handle. With a grunt, she pushed against it, but the door wouldn't budge. She tried again, but the metal groaned in protest. "We're running out of time," Miller hissed, fear creeping into his voice. "Get it open, Clara." "I'm trying," Clara snapped, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the lock. Miller glanced over his shoulder. The tunnel stretched endlessly behind them, but the sound of footsteps was unmistakable now. Whoever was coming was too close. They were running out of time. Finally, with a sharp click, the door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room beyond. Clara motioned for Miller to follow, and he ducked inside, just as the footsteps reached the end of the tunnel. They were inside the room, but Miller didn't feel safe. Not yet. He moved to the corner, trying to steady his breathing. The sound of heavy boots still echoed through the tunnel, and he knew they wouldn't be able to hide for long. "We need to get out of here," Miller said, his voice low but urgent. "Do you have any way of getting us out of this mess?" Clara's expression hardened, her jaw clenched. "We're not out of the woods yet. The exit from here is just a few yards away, but we'll have to get through the docks and past Ivanov's men. If they know we're here, we'll be dead before we reach the car." Miller nodded. He didn't need to be told twice. They had to move quickly. He peered through the small window in the room, and beyond it, he could see the faint outline of the dock. The fog had rolled in thick, and the dim lights of the dock area made the place feel like a ghost town. The docks were empty, but only for now. "We'll go through the back," Clara said, sensing Miller's hesitation. "It'll give us more cover, but we can't waste time. Once we get to the street, we'll be able to call for backup. If we don't, "If we don't, we're dead," Miller finished for her. Clara nodded grimly. There was no time to argue. They made their way down a narrow passageway that led into the back of the warehouse, where they found an exit that led to the docks. The sound of the foghorn in the distance only added to the tension, and Miller felt his senses on high alert as he moved with Clara through the shadows. But they weren't alone. Suddenly, the distant hum of an engine broke the silence. A black van appeared on the dock, its headlights cutting through the fog. The vehicle slowed as it reached the warehouse, and Miller could see the figures of men moving around it. Guards. Ivanov's men. "We need to move," Clara whispered urgently, tugging at Miller's sleeve. They ducked behind a pile of crates, hearts racing. Miller could hear the sound of heavy boots on the dock as the men unloaded crates from the van. Crates marked with the same symbols he had seen earlier. Whatever was in those crates, it was just as dangerous as Ivanov's weapons deal. Through the fog, Miller caught a glimpse of a familiar figure standing by the van. Ivanov. He was speaking to one of his men, his face shadowed but unmistakable. "This is it," Miller muttered, his voice steady. "We stop this now." Clara nodded, her grip tightening on the gun she had pulled from her jacket. They had only one chance. There could be no mistakes. Into the abyss, the fog hung heavy over the docks, swallowing everything in its path. The only light came from the flickering street lamps along the pier, their weak beams reflecting off the dark water. Miller's breath came in shallow bursts, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, but even more than that, there was a cold, gnawing sense of urgency. They had to stop this deal, or everything would unravel. Clara led the way, her steps swift and quiet, her eyes scanning the shadows ahead. Miller followed closely behind, every sense on high alert. They were moving through a maze of old warehouses, their high walls looming like silent sentinels, hiding the dock from view. The sounds of Ivanov's men unloading crates were unmistakable now, the dull thud of metal against concrete cutting through the mist. Clara stopped abruptly, signaling for Miller to do the same. She crouched behind a stack of wooden crates, peering around them to survey the scene. "Ivanov's men are unloading the last of the crates," she whispered. "The deal's about to go down. We don't have much time." Miller nodded, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the area. There were at least 5 men in sight, all heavily armed, moving with the practiced precision of soldiers. The crates they were unloading were large, and Miller could see that the markings on them were the same as those he had seen earlier. Foreign symbols that didn't belong anywhere near this dock. Whatever was in those crates, it was worth killing for. "Ivanov's here too," Clara muttered, spotting the man in the distance. "He's overseeing the shipment personally." Miller gritted his teeth. Ivanov had to be stopped. The weapons, the technology, everything had to be destroyed before it could reach the buyers. It was the only way to ensure Ivanov's empire would fall apart. "We need to get closer," Miller said. "We can't take them all on at once, but we can disrupt the deal. If we can sabotage the shipment, we've got a shot at stopping this." Clara nodded, her eyes steely with resolve. "I've got a plan. We need to cut off their escape route first. Once we've done that, we can move in." Miller glanced at her, surprised. Clara was usually more of a wild card, but tonight she was focused. She had a plan, and Miller was willing to trust her. "Let's do it," Miller said, his voice low. He adjusted his grip on his gun and waited for Clara's signal. Clara motioned for him to follow, and they moved in tandem, weaving through the stacks of crates like shadows. They had to be quick, efficient. One wrong move, and they'd be outnumbered and outgunned. They reached the edge of the dock, where a large cargo ship sat anchored, waiting to take the shipment away. There were guards stationed at various points, but none of them were paying attention to the side of the dock where Miller and Clara were creeping. "On my mark," Clara whispered. "We'll disable their vehicles. That'll slow them down long enough for us to get to Ivanov." Miller nodded, his hand tightening around the grip of his weapon. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just about catching a criminal. It was about stopping a global catastrophe. If they failed tonight, Ivanov's empire would only grow stronger, and the technology he was trafficking could end up in the hands of anyone willing to pay the price. The deal had to be stopped. Clara moved first, her footsteps light as she made her way toward the black van parked at the far end of the dock. Miller followed, his eyes darting back and forth, checking for any signs of movement. The guards were still distracted, their attention on the crates being unloaded. Clara reached the van, her fingers working quickly to disable the ignition system. Miller took a position behind a nearby crate, his gun aimed and ready. The seconds ticked by like hours, the weight of the moment hanging heavily in the air. Finally, Clara gave him the signal, a single quick nod. Miller sprang into action, charging toward the group of men by the cargo ship. He fired a single shot into the air, catching their attention. The guards turned, reaching for their weapons, but Miller was faster. He dropped to a crouch and fired 2 shots in rapid succession, taking down the nearest men before they could react. Chaos erupted in an instant. The sound of gunfire echoed across the docks, and the guards scrambled to return fire. But they weren't prepared for Miller's assault. He moved like a phantom, quick and precise, dodging behind crates and pillars to stay out of their line of sight. Clara was right behind him, moving with the fluidity of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. She took out 2 more guards with well-placed shots before the remaining men had a chance to react. Miller didn't stop to watch. He knew Ivanov was still on the dock, and he couldn't afford to waste time. He sprinted toward the cargo ship, hoping Clara had his back. The ship loomed ahead, its massive hull casting a shadow over the dock. Miller ducked behind a stack of crates and peeked around the corner, searching for Ivanov. There, at the far end of the dock, he saw him. Ivanov was standing with 2 of his men, watching the chaos unfold. The look on Ivanov's face was one of cold calculation. He didn't seem the least bit surprised. In fact, he seemed pleased that Miller's blood ran cold. Ivanov had expected this. He had been preparing for this moment the entire time that Miller's pulse quickened. Ivanov was about to slip away again. He couldn't let that happen. "Clara!" Miller shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "We need to take him now." But Clara's response wasn't what Miller expected. There was no immediate answer, only silence. And then, "Get down." Miller spun around just in time to see the muzzle flash from a nearby rooftop. The shot rang out with a deafening crack, and he felt the searing pain in his shoulder before he even realized what had happened. He staggered back, instinctively reaching for his wound, but there was no time. The shot had thrown him off balance, but he couldn't afford to fall. Not now. He heard Clara's voice again, this time urgent, calling out from behind him. "Miller, get down." He didn't need to be told twice. He dove behind a stack of crates, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The pain in his shoulder was excruciating, but he forced it aside. He had to keep moving. Ivanov's men were closing in, taking up positions around the dock. The sniper on the rooftop was still firing, and Miller could feel the weight of the situation closing in around him. If he didn't act fast, it would all be over. But then Clara was there, kneeling beside him, her gun drawn. "We're not done yet, Miller," she said, her voice calm but laced with tension. "We can still take them down. Together." Miller looked at her, and for the first time since the chaos had started, he felt a surge of hope. They had come this far. They weren't about to let Ivanov slip away. With Clara's help, they could still stop this deal. The fall of the Empire, the air, was thick with smoke and tension. The sound of gunfire echoed off the walls of the dock, punctuated by the distant cry of sirens. Miller's shoulder was on fire, but he ignored the pain. He had one goal now: stop Ivanov. The sniper on the rooftop had stopped firing for the moment, but Miller could still feel the weight of the man's eyes on him, waiting for the next shot. He glanced at Clara, who was crouched next to him, her face set with determination. She was good. She was calm. They were running out of time, but they still had a chance. "Clara, we need to move," Miller said, his voice hoarse from the adrenaline. "If we don't get Ivanov now, we'll lose him again. The deal will go through, and we won't be able to stop it." Clara nodded without hesitation. "I'm with you, but we need to split up. I'll cover you from the side. Get to Ivanov. I'll take care of the sniper." Miller hesitated. He hated the idea of splitting up, especially now when everything felt like it was coming apart at the seams. But there was no other way. They had to move fast, and if they stayed together, Ivanov's men would have the advantage. "All right, stay sharp," he said. He pushed himself to his feet, the pain in his shoulder nearly overwhelming, but he forced it aside. He had no time for weakness. Ivanov was slipping away, and he couldn't afford to let that happen again. Miller moved toward the far side of the dock, ducking behind crates and barrels, his eyes scanning for any sign of Ivanov. He could hear the muffled voices of Ivanov's men, but they weren't close enough to pose a threat yet. He spotted Ivanov standing near the edge of the dock, talking to one of the men in a dark suit. The deal was happening. The crates were already being loaded onto the ship. This was it. He took a deep breath and pushed forward. Every step felt like an eternity, but Miller moved with purpose, each footfall landing silently on the wet concrete. He wasn't about to let Ivanov escape. Not this time. Behind him, Clara was making her move, sneaking up the stairs to the rooftop where the sniper had taken position. Miller didn't know how she did it, but Clara was a force of nature when she was focused. He trusted her to take care of the sniper. All he had to do was get to Ivanov. As Miller moved closer, he could hear snippets of the conversation between Ivanov and the man in the suit. "Shipment is ready," the man said, his voice low. "It'll be on its way within the hour. You'll have everything you asked for." "Good," Ivanov replied, his voice smooth and confident. "This is just the beginning. Once we secure the technology, nothing will stop us. It's time to move the pieces into position." Miller's heart sank. Ivanov wasn't just trafficking weapons and tech. He was building something much bigger, the kind of power that could reshape the world. He had to stop it. Miller moved into position behind a stack of crates, drawing his gun. He aimed carefully, waiting for the perfect moment. Ivanov was just a few yards away, his back turned as he gestured toward the ship. He was distracted. This was the moment. Miller took a steadying breath and stepped out from behind the crates, his gun raised. "Ivanov!" The name hit the air like a thunderclap. Ivanov froze, his eyes flashing with surprise as he turned toward Miller. "You again," Ivanov sneered, his lips curling into a smile. "You're persistent. I'll give you that. But you've already lost." Miller's heart pounded as he aimed his gun at Ivanov. "It's over, Ivanov. This deal ends tonight. Your empire ends tonight." Ivanov laughed, a low, almost cruel sound that echoed through the mist. "You think you can stop this? You think you can stop me? You've been playing checkers while I've been playing chess. You have no idea how deep this goes." "You're right," Miller said, his voice steady. "But I'm not alone, and I don't need to understand everything. I just need to stop you." Suddenly, there was a crackling noise overhead. Miller's heart skipped a beat. The sniper on the roof had taken a shot. But before Miller could react, the sound of a second shot rang out, closer this time. The sniper's bullet missed him by inches, but it hit one of Ivanov's men square in the chest. The man dropped like a stone. Ivanov turned toward the sound, his face contorting with rage. You think you can stop me with a bullet? Pathetic." But Miller wasn't focused on Ivanov. He turned quickly, following the trajectory of the bullet and scanning the roof. Clara was there, crouched behind a stack of crates on the rooftop, her sniper rifle steady in her hands. She had taken out the sniper, and now, with a single shot, she had given them a fighting chance. Miller didn't waste a second. He dove toward Ivanov, his gun raised. Ivanov's men were scrambling, trying to regain control of the situation, but they were panicking. "Get him!" Ivanov shouted, his voice shaking with fury. The remaining guards moved to intercept, but Miller was already on them. He fired a few quick shots, taking down the closest threats with lethal precision. He wasn't giving up now, not when they were this close. Ivanov turned to flee, his suit jacket billowing behind him as he made a dash toward the ship. Miller was faster. He sprinted after him, ignoring the sharp pain in his shoulder, his mind focused entirely on the man in front of him. Miller reached out and grabbed Ivanov by the shoulder, spinning him around. Ivanov's eyes were wild with fear, but Miller's grip was iron. "You're done, Ivanov," Miller growled. "This ends now." Ivanov sneered. "You think you've won? This is just the beginning. I'll burn this world down before I let you ruin everything I've built." With that, Ivanov pulled out a small device from his pocket, a detonator. His fingers hovered over the button. Miller's pulse quickened. "No!" But before Ivanov could press it, a single shot rang out from behind them. Ivanov's hand dropped, the detonator falling to the ground with a dull thud. Clara stood behind them, her sniper rifle raised. Her shot had hit its mark, and Ivanov's plan was foiled. Ivanov looked at Miller, his eyes full of hatred. "You may have stopped this deal, but you'll never stop me. Watch me," Miller said, his voice cold. Before Ivanov could say another word, Miller drove his knee into Ivanov's stomach, knocking the air from his lungs. The man crumpled to the ground, gasping for breath. Clara stepped forward, lowering her rifle. "It's over, Victor. The Empire ends tonight." Miller nodded, his eyes never leaving Ivanov. This wasn't just a victory for them. It was for everyone Ivanov had exploited, for everyone he had hurt. The web of corruption and violence that Ivanov had built over decades was finally crumbling. The authorities arrived soon after. Backup had been alerted, and Ivanov's men were taken into custody. The crates of illicit goods were seized, and the deal that could have changed the world for the worse was stopped in its tracks as the sun began to rise over the horizon. Miller and Clara stood together, watching the authorities move in. The fog was lifting, and the first light of day was breaking through the haze. Miller winced as he adjusted his injured shoulder, but the pain was a distant thing now. He had done what needed to be done. They had stopped the deal. They had taken down Ivanov IT was over. Looks like we did it, Miller said, a weary smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Clara gave him a quick nod, but there was something else in her eyes. Something that said this wasn't the end. Not really. We stop him today, but there's always more, Miller. Miller looked at her, then out toward the horizon. I know, but we'll be ready. And with that, they walked off the docks together, ready for whatever came next.